I was standing near the edge of the room, half hidden behind a decorative column, watching the girl I raised walk across the stage. Her name echoed through the speakers, and the crowd clapped politely, but my hands didn't move. I had ironed that gown, I had steamed it twice. I had packed the backup heels in her bag when she said the first one's hurt. I had stayed up late the night before, writing a small letter to slip into her purse, reminding her how far she'd come. But at that dinner, with white tablecloths and wine glasses I couldn't pronounce. When someone asked who I was, she laughed softly and said, "Just the nanny, just the nanny." Not the woman who sat outside hospitals, who stitched costumes, who learned how to braid the way her mother used to. Not the one who said, "I'm proud of you," every time her real parents forgot to. The table chuckled. A few looked at me with sympathy, others with amusement, and I just nodded, pretending I hadn't heard. But the knot in my chest pulled so tightly, I thought I'd choke on the salad. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I only reached into my purse slowly, letting my fingers find the thin, folded paper I carried with me for years. Not because I planned to use it, but because I never wanted to forget. That receipt was from the tuition deposit, the first payment. The one her parents never showed up for. The one I made in cash, because the bank wouldn't give me a card. I sat back in my chair, still quiet, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to stay invisible tonight. Not anymore. I watched her from afar, like I always had, cheering in silence, clapping from the shadows, disappearing when the lights came on. That was my place, wasn't it? That's what I had been trained to believe. Over the years, I memorized the rhythm of being needed but never claimed. I knew how to cook without asking for a plate, how to help without asking for thanks. And maybe I told myself that was love. That sacrifice was love. But hearing those words, just the nanny in a room full of people, while wearing the same black dress I wore to her middle school recital, something snapped quietly inside me. I didn't want applause. I didn't want a toast. But I wanted to matter. I wanted to be more than a shadow in her story. And the truth is, I paid for so much more than that receipt. I paid in sleep I never recovered, in birthdays I missed with my own family, in overtime I never logged. I paid in silence, in kindness, in being there every single time her parents weren't. I never asked to be her mother. I never claimed a title, but I held her when she cried. I stayed through fevers and heartbreaks. I defended her when teachers didn't understand her moods. And now, after all of it, I was reduced to a punchline at a fancy table. I folded the receipt back into my purse, my hands steady. I didn't plan to speak that night, but sometimes the moment asks for you, and you either stay small or you rise. The waiter came by, asking if I needed anything, and I smiled politely, shaking my head. I didn't need water. I needed air. But leaving would have made it easier for them to erase me entirely, so I stayed. I watched her pose for pictures with people who had arrived in her life halfway through the story, acting like they had written the first chapters. She laughed with them, lifted her glass, and I realized I wasn't angry at her. Not really. I was angry at how small I had allowed myself to become in her world. I had accepted the background role too many times, thinking love was silent. That night, her father, who once forgot to pick her up from school because of a golf match, stood to make a toast. He spoke about pride and perseverance, about the strength of the family that raised her. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I just sat still, feeling the receipt like a pulse in my purse. When she glanced at me across the room, there wasn't guilt in her eyes, just comfort. She didn't think she'd done anything wrong, and maybe that hurt the most. She believed the version of the story where I was just a helper, someone kind enough to stick around but never central, never foundational. But I knew the truth. I knew who filled the gaps, who stayed when everyone else left. That night wasn't about revenge, it was about being seen. And sometimes being seen means showing up with quiet, proof-folded, dated, and undeniable. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, like I always did. Habit doesn't ask for permission to linger. I brewed the same coffee she liked, even though she wasn't home anymore, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where she once did homework. The silence was heavier now, not because she was gone, but because I finally admitted to myself how little space I had ever truly occupied. All those years, I convinced myself that being quiet was noble, that sacrificing without being acknowledged was a form of strength. But what if it wasn't? What if it was fear wearing a generous mask? I thought about how I used to leave sticky notes in her lunchbox, draw stars on her tests, whisper prayers when she felt afraid, and yet no one at that table knew my name. No one cared to ask. That kind of invisibility doesn't happen overnight. It's built slowly. Each time you tell yourself, it's okay, I don't need credit. Each time you swallow the hurt, and smile anyway. I looked at the purse still sitting on the counter, the receipt still folded inside. I hadn't shown it yet. I hadn't said a word. But last night something cracked open in me. I no longer wanted to be the silent witness of her life. I wanted to reclaim the parts of the story that belonged to me. Not for praise, not for recognition, but because I had been there fully, completely, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. Later that afternoon, I received a message from her, short, casual, like nothing had happened. "Thanks for coming last night," it read. "Everyone loved seeing you." No mention of what she said. No trace of apology. Just a polite acknowledgement, as if I had dropped by like a distant acquaintance. I stared at those words for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply with something warm, something that kept the peace. That part of me had always been louder. But another voice, quieter but steadier, began to rise. The one that remembered everything. The late nights, the skipped vacations, the groceries bought with coins when her parents' checks didn't arrive. I had never asked for repayment. I didn't raise her for gratitude. But something about that message, that breezy dismissal, made me realize how far apart we had grown. Not in distance, but in truth. She didn't see me anymore. Maybe she never had. And if I stayed silent again, I would be agreeing with her version of things. The one where I was just the nanny, the help, the woman who did her job and quietly left. But that wasn't the story. That wasn't the truth. I had been part of her foundation, a steady presence, a sacrifice she no longer remembered because it never asked to be remembered. I deleted the message, not out of anger, but to give myself space to think, to feel, to decide finally if I would keep being the silent chapter or if I was ready. To write a line of my own, I opened the drawer where I kept all the small things that didn't have a place, old receipts, folded letters, faded photos, among them a birthday card she'd made when she was 9. It had glitter glued to the corners and a drawing of us holding hands. She'd written in big, uneven letters, "You're my forever." I held it gently, letting the memory wash over me. That child had loved me fully, without filters, without labels. Somewhere along the line, the world had taught her otherwise, taught her who deserved recognition and who didn't. I couldn't blame her entirely, but I also couldn't keep carrying the weight of being forgotten. That afternoon, I called a lawyer I once helped during a difficult divorce. Years ago, I had watched her child for a week while she attended court. I never charged her. She had told me, "If you ever need anything, call me." I never had. Until now. When she answered, her voice was warm, surprised. I explained what I wanted, just a few changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but changes that mattered to me. She didn't question it. She said she'd draw up the paperwork. I hung up and sat in silence, not angry, not triumphant, just still. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had given something to myself. A quiet correction to the story, a small return to my own name. I wasn't erasing anyone. I was simply placing a bookmark where my chapter had always deserved to begin. A few weeks passed before she visited again. It wasn't planned. Just a quick stop on her way somewhere else. She rang the bell like a guest, not like someone returning home, but like someone checking off an obligation. I opened the door with the same familiar smile, the one I had worn for years, and she stepped in with her phone still in her hand, barely looking up. "I won't stay long," she said. "Just came to grab a few things." I left. I nodded and pointed toward the hallway closet. She moved around like a stranger, like someone tracing old steps they barely remembered. I watched her eyes skip. Over the photos on the wall, most of them were of her childhood. Pictures I'd printed, framed, and dusted with care. She paused for a moment at one, maybe recognizing a piece of her past, but then moved on quickly. As she rummaged through the closet, I sat on the armchair, fingers gently folded over my lap. I wasn't going to explain anything today. I wasn't going to hand her guilt wrapped in words. This wasn't about that. But I did want her to look around to see if any of it still meant something to her. The walls, the smells, the softness of the rug she once fell asleep on after school. She didn't ask how I'd been. She didn't ask if I needed anything. And for the first time, that didn't wound me. It revealed something, a clarity, the kind that comes not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that something had shifted and that maybe it was time I shifted with it. She found the jacket she'd been looking for, held it up, and smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd still have it?" she said, almost surprised. I didn't respond right away. I had kept everything, not because I expected her to come back, but because letting go of those pieces had always felt like letting go of her. She ran her fingers along the sleeve and added, "You really kept everything, huh?" I smiled softly, then stood up and walked to the kitchen. "Do you want tea?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. We sat at the same table where I had once taught her how to write her name in cursive. Her phone buzzed twice, but she ignored it for a moment. Something in her had slowed down. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was the memories. She took a sip of tea and looked around. "It's like nothing's changed," she whispered. I smiled again, this time with a hint of sadness. Some things. Did I? Said gently. She looked at me, curious but unsure. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. That receipt was no longer just paper in my purse. It had become something else, a decision, a truth, a quiet protection. I had signed the papers 2 days earlier. The house now belonged to me. Not because I wanted to take something from her, but because I had realized that I had given enough. Without boundaries. That loving someone doesn't mean erasing yourself. She didn't know it yet. But that knowledge rested calmly in my chest, no longer needing her permission to matter. She stayed a little longer than expected. Maybe the tea slowed her down, or maybe the air in the house still held something she hadn't found anywhere else. As we sat in silence, she finally looked me in the eye and said, "You know, I didn't mean it like that." At the dinner, her voice was low, but the words were sharp. I nodded slowly, not to dismiss her, but to acknowledge the effort it took. To say even that much? It's just everyone was watching, and I didn't know what to say, she added, shrugging. I waited a few seconds before speaking. You said what felt natural to you. I replied gently. That's what stung. She looked away, her fingers tracing circles on the cup. For the first time, she seemed uncomfortable in the space she once ran through barefoot, and I let the silence stretch, not to punish her, but to protect myself. She wasn't ready to face everything, that was clear. But I was, and that changed the balance between us. I didn't forget, she whispered. About the times you stayed. About what you did? I smiled, not with joy, but with the tired peace of someone who no longer needed that confession to breathe. I know, I said, but I needed to remember it for myself first. Her eyes glistened a little, but she didn't cry. Neither did I. It wasn't a scene from a movie. It was two people, sitting with a past too heavy for words. And in that moment, I understood that letting go doesn't always come with closures. Sometimes it comes with quiet control. 2 days later, I went to the notary's office to collect the final papers. Everything had been filed, witnessed, and sealed. The house was now under my name, with no room for contestation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Like I had finally stepped into a space I had always cleaned, maintained, and protected, but never truly owned. On my way home, I passed the school she used to attend. I remembered the afternoons waiting by the gate, holding a juice box and a sweater, hoping she'd had a good day. I remembered how she'd run to me, her backpack bouncing, shouting my name louder than anyone else's. That little girl would have never said, "Just the nanny." That little girl had loved me loudly, without shame, without calculation. But life teaches people to reassign value, to organize their love according to mirrors and manners. And somewhere along the way, I had fallen into a category she believed didn't belong at her table. That was no longer my burden to carry. When I got home, I opened every window, let the breeze move through each room, and made myself tea in the big mug she once painted for me. The house didn't feel empty. It felt full of my quiet decisions. I wasn't waiting for anyone to visit. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I had done what needed to be done, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I had reclaimed the one thing. I always gave so freely, my presence. And for the first time, it wasn't in service of anyone else. It was mine. That evening, I found myself organizing old drawers not out of necessity, but as a way to mark the transition. In the back of one, I found a notebook filled with recipes written in my handwriting and hers. Some pages were stained with oil, others decorated with little doodles she had drawn when she was small. "You make it better than anyone," she had once written next to the rice pudding recipe. I traced the ink with my finger, feeling a pang of something softer than pains, something like grief, but gentler. Not for the loss of her, but for the illusion I'd lived under for so long. I had believed that love guaranteed place, that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, I would be chosen, acknowledged. But families don't always work like that. Some are born, some are built, and some, like mine, are blurred. My role in her life had always been sacred to me, but that didn't mean it was sacred to her. And now, I had made peace with that. I kept the notebook, placed it in a new drawer, not hidden but not on display, just where it belonged, accessible, but no longer defining me. The house was quiet, but it wasn't silent. It held echoes, not wounds. It held memory, not regret. And as I lit a small candle on the table, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure, because I wasn't waiting for that anymore. What I felt was presence, a return to myself. The woman who stayed, the woman who gave, and now the woman who decided what stayed and what didn't. The next morning, a letter slid through the front door. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded sheet of paper with my name on it. Her handwriting. I stood there for a moment before picking it up, unsure of what I hoped to find inside. An apology, an explanation, or just a fragment of the girl I once knew, reaching back through layers of silence. I unfolded it slowly. "I know I hurt you," it began. "I didn't see it at first, but now I do." The letter was short, awkward, in places like someone trying to write a language they hadn't spoken in years. She mentioned the dinner, the receipt, the look on my face. She said she thought she was protecting an image, trying to fit into a world that rewarded polished stories and invisible sacrifices. "You were never invisible to me," she wrote. "I just didn't know how to make room for the truth." I read it twice, then folded it back the way she had. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. The words didn't erase what was done, but they reached me because they were hers, unprompted. I placed the letter next to the deed in a drawer. I now called mine. Not everything needed to be framed. Some things were better tucked away, present but private. That letter didn't change the past, but it marked a soft thread being pulled through something once tight and tangled. I didn't know what would come next between us, but for the first time, it would be on my terms, woven from truth, not silence. A week later, I was invited to a small family gathering. Nothing formal, just a quiet brunch at her new apartment. I hesitated before saying yes, not out of resentment, but because I wanted to be sure I was walking in, with my eyes open, this time. Not as the help, not as someone hoping for scraps of validation, but as myself. When I arrived, she opened the door and hugged me longer than usual. There was a nervousness in her smile, a searching in her eyes. The room was filled with people I didn't know, friends from work, neighbors, a colleague from her college days. As we settled around the table, the conversations began to swirl. New jobs, travel plans, wedding dates. I stayed quiet at first, listening. Then, halfway through the meal, someone asked her who taught her to cook. She paused. For a moment, I expected her to mention a class or a friend, but she turned to me instead and said, "She did." Every eye followed her gaze. "She raised me," she added, her voice steady, not officially, not by blood, but she's the reason I know how to sit at a table like this. The room fell silent for a breath, then moved on, but I didn't. I stayed in that moment. It didn't erase the dinner or the years of silence, but it was something, a thread, a recognition, and not because I demanded it, but because she chose to speak it out loud in front of everyone. For once, I wasn't a shadow in the room. I was part of the light. After brunch, while the others lingered with coffee and laughter, she asked if I could stay a little longer, just the two of us. We sat by the window where the light softened the lines on both our faces. She looked tired, but not in the way that begged for sleep, in the way people do when they've been carrying something too long. "I used to think I owed everything to my parents," she said, "that giving them credit was the only way to keep the peace." She paused, but they weren't the ones who stayed up with me. They weren't the ones who came to every parent-teacher conference. Her voice cracked slightly. "You were." I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. I was ashamed for a while, of not knowing how to thank you, of realizing too late how much you gave. She looked at me then, eyes full, and "I'm sorry." For all of it, I reached over, placed my hand on hers. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no music, no applause, just warmth. Just weight, lifting quietly between us. Forgiveness isn't always a thunderclap hits, sometimes a breath that doesn't catch anymore. We sat in that stillness, not rushing to fill it. The truth had been named, and now it could rest. I didn't need her to rewrite the past. I just needed her to see it, and she did. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not forever, but in that room, in that moment, I was no longer just anything. I was someone who mattered, out loud. When I returned home, the afternoon light was spilling gently across the hallway floor. I took off my shoes, placed my purse on the same hook I always had, and breathed in the quiet. But this time, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like space I had earned. There were no more unspoken debts, no more waiting for someone else to name my worth. I walked through each room slowly, touching the corners I used to clean while humming lullabies, the walls that once held finger paintings, the kitchen where I'd stirred more than just meals. This house wasn't just mine by paper, now it belonged to my history, my love, my invisible years made visible. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe she'd call more often, maybe she wouldn't, but I had stopped measuring my value by how much someone else remembered. The receipt stayed tucked in my drawer next to her letter. I would probably never show it again, but I didn't need to. That night at the graduation dinner, when she called me just the nanny, she didn't know what I carried. Now she does. And more importantly, so do I. I sat down by the window, poured myself a cup of tea, and smiled softly into the quiet. Not because everything was perfect, but because, finally, I wasn't trying to disappear inside someone else's story. I had written my own page, folded it gently, and placed it where it belonged. Have you ever been made to feel invisible till you finally decided to show what you'd carried all along?